Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a breaking and frankly incredibly tense geopolitical stalemate that literally holds the Middle East and really the whole world in suspense. So right now, we've got a very fragile ceasefire in place. This comes after a period of direct military engagement between the US, Israel, and Iran. But the peace talks that are supposed to turn that pause into a permanent end to hostilities, well, they've hit a massive radioactive roadblock. We're going to look strictly at the facts, the competing demands, and the raw data driving the standoff so we can understand exactly what's happening behind closed doors. Okay, let's dive right into this. This entire stalemate really hinges on one incredibly dramatic revelation. According to two senior Iranian sources who spoke anonymously to Reuters, the absolute highest authority in Iran has just drawn a line in the sand. The directive is crystal clear. The stockpile of enriched uranium cannot, under any circumstances, leave Iranian soil. And as you'll see, this single sentence completely upends the core demand from the West and instantly threatens to derail the whole fragile diplomatic process. So, to make sense of all this, here is how we're going to break it down. First, the uranium standoff. Then, the competing peace demands. After that, we'll look at the fragile ceasefire currently in place, track the situation by the numbers, and finally explore finding a compromise. Let's get into it.
Section 1. The uranium standoff, a hardened stance.
All right, so this directive we mentioned comes directly from Ayatollah Mujtaba Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader. He's the one who holds the absolute final authority over all major state decisions. And his order insists that the country's stockpile of near weapons-grade enriched uranium absolutely must remain inside Iran. Now, this is a monumental decision. Why? Because it directly and forcefully opposes Washington's most fundamental requirement for peace. See, U.S. President Donald Trump had reportedly assured Israel that any peace agreement would definitively include the physical removal of this highly enriched uranium from Iranian territory. So right out of the gate, we've got an immovable object meeting an unstoppable force. And that brings us to the crux of the issue, perfectly illustrated by this number right here, 60%. This isn't just a random figure, It's the exact scientific threshold that's causing all this international anxiety. Let's actually define what 60% enrichment really means in practice. This is a level that is significantly higher than what is required for just standard civilian nuclear power. It pushes the material much, much closer to the threshold required for an actual nuclear weapon, which is generally considered to be around 90%. Because of this, Israel, the United States, and several Western nations look at that 60% figure and accuse Iran of actively pursuing nuclear weapons capabilities. On the flip side, Iran has consistently and vehemently denied seeking a bomb. They maintain that this highly enriched uranium is intended strictly for medical applications and for a research reactor based in Tehran. Section 2. Competing peace demands. A diplomatic stalemate. Just look at the vast, almost unbridgeable distance between these two negotiating tables. On one side, you have the US and Israel demanding that Iran completely removes the enriched uranium stockpile, halts all support for proxy militias, and dismantles its ballistic missile program. But on the other side, Iran has its own absolute prerequisites for peace. They want a permanent end to the war, and crucially, credible, ironclad guarantees that the US and Israel won't launch future attacks. In fact, Iranian officials have straight up stated they won't even engage in detailed nuclear negotiations until those specific guarantees are met. So you might be wondering, why is Iran so stubbornly holding onto the uranium if it's the main obstacle to the peace they're asking for? Well, according to sources close to Tehran's leadership, it really comes down to a deep sense of vulnerability. Iranian leaders firmly believe that if they surrender their leverage by sending the uranium abroad, they're stripping themselves of a critical deterrent. In their view, giving it up would leave the country highly exposed and essentially invite future military attacks from the United States and Israel. Section 3. A very fragile ceasefire. The broader battlefield. To really grasp the gravity of this situation, we need to look at exactly how we got here. On February 28th, U.S.-Israeli strikes hit Iran, basically erupting into open conflict. Right after those strikes, the whole region flared up. Iran targeted Gulf states hosting U.S. military bases, and clashes severely intensified between Israel and the Iran-backed Hezbollah in Lebanon. Fast forward to right now, and we are sitting in a very, very fragile ceasefire, with Pakistan stepping in to actively mediate the talks. But as you can probably guess, trying to mediate a conflict of this sheer scale is unbelievably difficult. And Pakistan's mediation efforts are currently being hindered by some massive roadblocks, both physical and psychological. Complicating diplomacy right on the ground is a strict U.S. blockade of Iranian ports, which is crippling trade. Simultaneously, you've got Tehran leveraging its control over the Strait of Hormuz, a literal global economic choke point. But honestly, perhaps the biggest hurdle isn't physical at all. It's this deep-seated suspicion within Tehran that Washington is simply using the ceasefire as a tactical pause to just reload and regroup. This absolute lack of trust is the main friction point. Mohammad Bakour Kalibafov, Iran's top peace negotiator, said on Wednesday that obvious and hidden moves by the enemy indicate the United States is actively preparing for new attacks. So Tehran really doesn't view this as a genuine peace process. A lot of folks within their leadership view it as basically the eye of the storm before the next wave of bombers arrives. And to be fair to that suspicion, the threats of violence aren't exactly being kept secret. U.S. President Donald Trump explicitly warned that Washington is fully prepared to launch further attacks on Tehran if Iran refuses to agree to a peace deal. He even suggested that the U.S. might only wait a few days to get the right answers. So this places an incredibly tight, ticking clock on these negotiations. The threat of renewed military action is completely out in the open. Section 4, by the numbers, tracking the stockpile. Let's look at the hard data for a second, because we aren't just talking about abstract ideas here. We're talking about a highly tracked, physical inventory. According to the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, as of June 2025, which was right when the U.S. and Israeli forces attacked Iranian nuclear facilities, Iran possessed an estimated 440.9 kilograms of uranium enriched to that critical 60% level. So where is all this material? IAEA Chief Rafael Grossi believes most of the surviving stockpile is buried deep underground in tunnels at the Isfahan nuclear facility, with some material also remaining over at the Natanz enrichment complex. Now, to make sure we have a fully comprehensive picture of the regional nuclear landscape, it is absolutely vital to note Israel's position here. Israel is widely believed by the international community to possess its own nuclear weapons. However, the state maintains a strict policy of deliberate ambiguity. They have never officially confirmed nor denied having an atomic arsenal. This asymmetry in declared nuclear capabilities heavily colors the diplomatic psychology across the entire Middle East. Finally, Section 5, finding a compromise. Pathways to peace. Interestingly enough, there actually was some diplomatic flexibility relatively recently. Before this latest violent escalation, Iran had reportedly signaled a willingness to export half of its 60% enriched uranium. I mean, that was a massive potential concession. However, sources note that this stance quickly hardened and shifted back following repeated threats of military strikes. Essentially, the reality of war caused Tehran to pull back its concessions and lock down its assets. But there might still be a glimmer of hope. One Iranian source suggested to Reuters that a compromise to resolve this specific dispute is actually still on the table. If exporting the material is a hard red line for the supreme leader, the proposed solution looks a little something like this. Step 1. Iran gets to keep the enriched uranium stockpile physically inside the country, which satisfies their demand for sovereignty and security. Step 2. They dilute the stockpile, mixing it down to much lower, purely civilian enrichment levels. This satisfies the U.S. and Israeli demand that the weapons-grade threat be removed. And Step 3. This entire dilution process is conducted under the strict, on-the-ground supervision of the IAEA. It's actually a pretty elegant diplomatic solution that addresses the core fears of both sides. But as we know, in international relations, logic often takes a back seat to momentum. With a tight deadline suggested by Washington and deep-seated paranoia reigning in Tehran, the ultimate question remains. With threats of new strikes looming, will a compromise be reached before time runs out? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. The clock is definitely ticking, and we're going to be watching very closely to see what happens next.